This is a whatIwantoknow.com presentation.
I have regrets. Only a fool has no regrets. But on the big political issues, I've been consistently right, and those who rule us have been consistently wrong.
When you binge watch 3 documentaries about Saddam Hussein and his sons, you learn a lot. And afterwards, you're keen to learn even more. So naturally, I had to set up a conversation with George Galloway, a man who had met Saddam and his son Uday in person in Iraq. And I don't remember exactly when George Galloway appeared on my radar, but it was probably through YouTube, where you can find numerous videos of him debating on TV shows or in lecture halls. Here's one video's titled, George Galloway debates 100 Zionists at the same time and wins. The man clearly had a way with words, and I eventually learned about his reputation for his scathing attacks towards his ideological enemies. For decades, he's been very vocal and persistent about many hot-button issues, especially in the Middle East. He decried the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and continues to play devil's advocate for the Saddam Hussein regime. He is staunchly anti-Zionism, eternally pro-Palestine, and consistently pro-Hezbollah. He is known for steadfast opinions and has barely changed his tune over the years. Born in Dundee, Scotland in 1954, Galloway was raised in a left-leaning home. After stints working in a tire factory, as any true leftist must, he turned to politics with a fully formed liberal philosophy in place. At age 26, he was an organizer and chairman in Scotland for the Labour Party. He then went on to secure a position as a member of Parliament. He was known for his passionate speeches, his ability to resonate with audiences, and his activist-like approach to politics. His anti-war stance created an affinity and sympathy for many of the targets of British and American imperialism. Particularly, he became entrenched in debates regarding the Middle East. His views were often unpopular and countercultural in the UK, but they gained him much praise across the Arab world and with Muslims in the UK. Because of these sentiments, Mr. Galloway has been granted rare access to many infamous dictators. He says it's diplomacy, but for his critics, it's tantamount to being an apologist for tyrants. He has, no doubt, met with some of the most controversial world leaders of the 21st century: Saddam, Assad, Iran's Ahmadinejad, Fidel Castro, the list goes on. And over the decades, Galloway has had a very colorful and controversial time in the spotlight. He's been in and out of office, been kicked out of the Labour Party. But despite that, he has continually found a way to get elected. A BBC profile of Galloway once summed up a 2005 election win like this: whether you admire him, loathe him, or lampoon him, never ever underestimate the man who first rattled Labour Party by recording one of the biggest shocks in recent political history. Galloway also spends time as a presenter for 3 television channels. He hosts talk shows on Iran's Press TV, Russia Today, and Lebanon's Al Mayadeen. Of course, this only increases the sphere of controversy that surrounds him, as many people see him as a mouthpiece for these regimes. I caught up with George Galloway over the phone from his home in London, England, to ask him about his colorful career. There is much I want to know about this controversial and dedicated polemicist. From Hezbollah to Saddam Hussein, to the art of debating, to meeting Che Guevara's son, we cover it all. I thought, a good way to start the interview was to read this quote from you from 2012, because I think it might sort of help set up the conversation. You said in an interview that you're not a pacifist, that you're a revolutionary. You said, "I'm a socialist who doesn't like capitalism and who likes imperialism less. I'm a revolutionary and I support the armed struggle where there is no alternative." Just before we get going, would you say that's still an accurate description of your views?
Absolutely, yes, and always has been.
Okay. So I wanted to start with Hezbollah, because reading that sentence, Hezbollah really just jumps to the front of my mind. The Shia political and armed group in Lebanon. And it's an organization that you've been highly supportive in the past, which is, in many people's view, controversial. But do you think that Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah is still a great Arab leader?
Hassan Nasrallah is undoubtedly one of very few outstanding Arab leaders in this era. He's, of course, handicapped in becoming the leader of the Arabs because of sectarian differences. But undoubtedly, he is by far and away in this current period the outstanding Arab leader.
I was talking to a good friend of mine, an Iraqi friend, and he would tell me back in the day, you would go into, bars and homes in Sunni strongholds across the Arab world, and his picture would be all over the wall. And he was just like the one guy that united all Arabs and was just the hero. Do you find that to be accurate, that he was such a hero?
Yes. In 2006, you could say that amongst the vast majority of Christians, Sunni and Shiites in Lebanon and way beyond, Hassan Nasrallah was the hero of the hour, a leader who meant what he said and said what he meant, right, and who never made idle promises, rash promises, never pretended that black was white and white was black. Quite a different kind of Arab leader. The normal Arab leader is constantly claiming victories that are in fact defeats, whereas the manner of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is very, very different to that. But obviously, it's having been drawn into the war in Syria has undoubtedly damaged it somewhat. And actually, the wobble that they had over the invasion of Iraq in 2003 also damaged them a bit. They won a lot of respect around the world in the Lebanon war in 2006. And that perhaps made up, in most people's eyes, for the slight ambiguity for a period over the invasion of Iraq. But the being drawn into the Syrian imbroglio has lost them a lot of ground.
And after going into Syria, having to back Assad, a lot of his popularity fell. Do you think there was any way Hezbollah could have avoided that to sort of save face, or was this what they had to do?
They had to do because, as Hassan Nasrallah put it himself, you can't stand with your arms folded when someone is trying to break your spine. The reality is that the Takfiri victory and ISIS victory in Syria would be more or less the end for the Lebanese resistance. Just logistically and politically, the position would become extremely, gravely difficult for the Lebanese resistance. So they had no alternative but to become involved. But they have paid a price, both in blood and also, as you say, in popularity.
Obviously, he seems like a person that you would be intrigued and fascinated to meet with and sit and talk with, but that's never been anything that's been on the cards for you or ever been possible that you've tried to set up?
No.
Because you're a presenter, because you're an interviewer yourself, if you did have a chance to sit down with him, what's one question you'd have to ask him?
Well, let me be absolutely clear. I have never asked to meet him. I have never asked to interview him, and I never will ask to meet him or interview him. But undoubtedly, that would be the question, the one that we've just been discussing. How can the sectarian division amongst the Muslims in the world, and it's a much wider problem than just the Arab Middle East, but the sectarian differences within the Muslim world, how can they be bridged somehow?
Right.
That would keep us going for a day or two, I'm sure.
Right, absolutely. We've talked just about how Nasrallah has taken a hit because of Syria. Do you feel like you've taken a hit in terms of stature in the Arab world because of your opinions on Assad?
Yeah, sure. Well, no doubt we'll discuss what my opinions actually are.
Yeah, absolutely.
But my opposition to the so-called revolution in Syria has undoubtedly polarized opinions. And once upon a time, and for quite a long time, every Arab, more or less, outside the comprador of the various dictatorships, would probably have expressed regard for me, and maybe more, maybe love in many cases. But undoubtedly, just like everyone else, when one is forced to make a choice, especially an unpalatable one, between bad and worse, those that prefer worse will be angry with you for choosing bad.
Is it an example of a time when maybe you wish you would have waited for more information or thought about it? Because I know that, your opinions new information has come out as, the conflict has gone on that I think has sort of maybe softened your support of Assad. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think 12 months ago, yes, I was supposed to go to Damascus to pick up a British surgeon, Dr. Khan, who had been incarcerated in Syria for some time, having been captured on the battlefield in and around Aleppo, I think. And a day or 2 days before I was supposed to fly to Beirut and thence to Damascus to bring this man home to his wife and small children, I was informed that he had hanged himself 2 days before he was to be released into my custody, my care. And I told the Syrian official who informed me of this that no one in Britain would believe this story, that I didn't believe it, and that I could not possibly pretend that I believed it. So since that day, in fact, it's 2 years now, not one, I have not exchanged a single word with any Syrian official, and I have no real plans to do so. So I was sickened. I was disgusted by this act of murder, which it almost certainly was. I say almost certainly because, of course, none of us were there in the cell, but knowing his family well by then, knowing his mother who'd seen him just a day or two before, the idea that he hanged himself just before I was coming to get him, he was going to be reunited with his children and so on, is frankly absurd.
So are you suggesting in some way that it might have been to send a message to you, or it just showed you how brutal Assad had become?
I'm certain that it had nothing to do with Assad,
Okay.
But in a way that makes it even worse.
Right.
It means that Assad and the regime are not the same thing. That the regime is more powerful than Assad. That the regime is capable of murdering someone that Assad has called one of Syria's few defenders in the world to come and get, but the regime kill him anyway. It's long been my view that one of the great paradoxes of Western policy was that they seem to want rid of Assad but keep the regime, whereas in fact Assad is not as bad as the regime. So the policy ought to have been the other way around.
When you talk about Assad and the revolution and that, from one perspective, when I started to learn about this, the idea that when the popular uprising began, if there had been a way to transition power or to step down at that moment, do you really think that there could have been a chance for a successful revolution before all the militia groups came into that vacuum?
I conveyed to President Assad the day after the flight of Ben Ali from Tunisia and urged him to hold a free and fair presidential election, thus making himself, because I'm certain he would have won it, making himself the only democratically elected leader in the Arab world. He should have taken that advice. I like to think he knows that. But just as I've just been saying in the case of Dr. Khan, the regime and Assad are not exactly identically the same thing.
Right.
And the regime is worse than Assad.
Right. Exactly. One question I wanted to ask you. So, in advance of this interview, there's this a Syrian guy I know, and I knew that his perspective was quite critical on your take on Syria and Assad, because he supports the Free Syrian Army, he supports the revolution. And I said, what would you want me to ask Galloway for you? And he said, ask him if he is aware of or acknowledges the fact that Syria and Assad's regime were extremely oppressive to Palestinians within Syria and Lebanon. How do you respond to that?
Well, every Arab government, without exception,
Right.
could be accused of that. So, insofar as that is true, it's certainly not uniquely a crime of the regime in Damascus. I could go through, but it would take our whole time period, from the Atlantic to the Gulf. The betrayals, the letdowns, the repression, oppression of the Palestinian national movement and individual Palestinians. I could go through them one by one, and every one of them would be guilty. So I really don't think that is a particularly telling question. Your friend could have actually come up with a better one. But insofar as that's true, and it surely is, we then move on to a comparison. Compared to the other regimes, the Syrian regime has remained more faithful or less unfaithful. It has been more supportive of the Palestinian resistance, particularly the Islamic resistance, Hamas. It had a long-standing feud with the late President Arafat, with whom I was closely associated and still am closely associated with his politics. The resistance with the relationship to the Palestinian resistance was greater than any other regime, and at a time when it was almost impossible for the resistance to operate anywhere else. So I think that Hamas owed the Syrian regime quite a significant debt, given the importance of Hamas to the Palestinian resistance, the fact that the Syrian regime harbored them, protected them, and gave them the means of life and struggle, means that your friend's case or charge, indictment, doesn't really hold that much weight. Of course, in every case, we're talking relatively.
Right.
There is no doubt that the Syrian regime oppressed Palestinians, repressed them, let them down, and so on, but much less so than the other Arab regimes.
Right. Now, speaking of other Arab regimes, I'm very fascinated to talk with you about Iraq. One of my best friends here in D.C. is Iraqi, and his family fled during the Saddam era. But through him, I've learned a lot about it, and I've become extremely fascinated with the man and his family. On a personal level, I'm just very curious to know if you could go into a little bit of detail for me, and I know you've written about it, about what it was like to meet Saddam and sort of be in his presence. You wrote that he radiated power. Could you expand on that for me?
Well, there are some leaders who do and some who don't. I was just from my Tony Blair film looking at some footage of one of the Arab tyrants, Emir of Kuwait.
Okay.
And I have met many of the other leaders, including the late King of Saudi Arabia, and few of them radiate power. Few of them are significant or likely to be remembered in any way at all. But of course, that's not true of Saddam Hussein. So undoubtedly, he was a big and powerful figure. We have a saying in English, they do in Arabic also, that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is the king. And in the land of the blind Arab leaders, Saddam Hussein had one eye, and that made him the king. He had some significant achievements, but he made such gargantuan blunders that any proper evaluation of his era would decree overwhelming and final failure. But that doesn't mean that everything that he did was wrong. And it would be wrong to suggest, I only met him twice, but the second time for about an hour and a half, it would be wrong to suggest that he came across as a madman or some kind of crazy, because he didn't. He was perfectly calm, perfectly rational. He responded rationally to the appeals that I and others had been making to allow the arms inspectors back in.
Okay.
He allowed me to announce that they could come back in, and a fat lot of good it did, because it's clear that Bush and Blair had already resolved to attack and invade and occupy Iraq in any case.
Right. When you look at Saddam, you mentioned you can't say everything he did was bad. People look at a guy like Hitler and say, look what he did to the German economy. Look at the amazing things Hitler did. But don't you think Saddam Hussein, in the long run of history, when we look at, repressive dictators, is guilty of crimes as atrocious as someone like a Hitler?
No one is responsible for crimes on the scale of Adolf Hitler. No one, hopefully, ever will be. This is overblown Fox News type comparisons. Hitler was a European dictator at the head of a very powerful industrialized state with an army of millions capable of subjugating and occupying all of his neighbors and systematically annihilating upwards of 10 or 11 million people in the Holocaust and causing a world war that cost the lives of almost 100 million people. So on a scale, Saddam Hussein doesn't come close. He was a brutal dictator, as all the Arab rulers are, to one extent or another. When I say that not everything he did was wrong, I'm very clear about that and have written extensively about it. The period before the Iran-Iraq war, which was arguably his greatest blunder, was a period in which Iraq built a science base, built an industrial base, sent more students around the world to do PhDs and advanced educational courses, and so on, more than any other Arab country by far and away. In every country of the world, there were Iraqis studying for PhDs. The nationalization of the oil industry, the use to which the profits of the oil were put, these were all quite significant achievements of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq.
Right. Now,
but the blunders and crimes were so gigantic that, as I say, any proper evaluation would find them bankrupt in the end.
Is there a story you know of that you could tell me that most exemplifies how disturbing and messed up Saddam Hussein was? Because I've heard stories that just blow my mind.
No, I don't. I know, of course, of thousands of stories, most of which are probably black propaganda, and and some of which may contain a germ of truth. There is no doubt that, like Stalin, whom he had many similarities with Stalin, a kind of smaller Stalin. His own comrades in his own party paid a price proportionately even greater than the population as a whole. So I'm sure that the stories of Saddam Hussein killing or causing the death of his own comrades in the party, both in Iraq and across the Arab world, I'm sure that they contain significant amounts of truth.
Okay.
But I have no special knowledge about it.
Okay, and another person who has become extremely fascinating to me is Uday, the son, the younger son, I believe, of Saddam. Do you think he was equally as brutal and vicious as Saddam? Because a lot of people think that.
Well, I only met him once, and I only know what the propaganda says about him. By the time I met him, he was physically damaged in quite a serious way.
Right, because he was shot, right?
He was shot, yes, and he could barely stand, and when he could barely sit. What I do think is that he was fantastically corrupt, and that corruption caused a very great amount of damage to the regime and the credibility and standing of the regime, which once was high.
Right.
It would be wrong for you to imagine that the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was without support.
Right.
That's simply not true. Right. There are millions of supporters of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and even today there are. And I do recall a conversation that I had with some of the Iraqi leadership, not Saddam, in which I described to them how Fidel Castro's son worked on the shop floor in a power plant and wore overalls to work, yet carried the name of his father. Fidel Castro Jr. Was an industrial worker. And I went on to tell them that I once shared an apartment block with the son of Che Guevara, who was a $30 a month functionary in the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Havana. And I could tell that the Iraqi leaders were listening to this with a mixture of disbelief and horror, because of course it's very different in the Arab world. The son of the ruler in the Arab world is not only somebody big, but he's almost certainly a thief on a grand scale.
Right.
And I think that Uday was a thief on a grand scale.
Right. Now, I'm curious because there's some amazing, disturbing stuff of him on YouTube. Have you seen these videos of him like shooting his machine gun at weddings and going to parties and forcing like old men to drink alcohol? Have you seen these videos?
No, I haven't.
They're crazy because, I mean, the way that he used to roam around Baghdad and the crimes he would commit with with pure impunity are just kind of blow my mind. You haven't seen any of that stuff or followed any of those stories?
No, I'm afraid there's more contemporary horrors
absolutely.
In Iraq that occupy my mind. Both Saddam Hussein and Uday Hussein are long dead.
One quick last question on that. When I think about Saddam, when I think about Uday, maybe it's the way you need to look at a guy like Uday is that he was like extremely mentally ill, because the way he was raised, to be raised with Saddam, to be raised to be a killer, the things he saw, that says in a way you can't blame him for the way he acted, but there was no way you could have ever reasoned with a guy like Uday because he was mentally ill. Do you think that's a reasonable way to look at it?
I haven't the remotest idea. I only was in one room with him once, and for quite a short period of time. So I could certainly tell you he was physically ill, but I have no idea about his mental state. The line between bad and mad is in any case quite a difficult one to discern.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There's the great debate you had with Christopher Hitchens, which was back in 2005, and you said to him in the debate, Mr. Hitchens' policy has succeeded in making 10,000 new Bin Ladens, and obviously much of what that related to was what essentially would become, I suppose, the rise of ISIL. Do you feel vindicated in your ability to see that coming and to be able to put that to someone like Hitchens, who was so supportive of overthrowing Saddam?
Well, I underestimated the number of Bin Ladens by quite an order of magnitude. There are far, far more than 10,000 Bin Ladens now in the world. There are probably millions of Bin Ladens now in the world. And so I underestimated it all. But I was certainly much closer to the truth than Mr. Hitchens and many others of our rulers who led us into this disaster. But yes, on the big issues, I've made mistakes, of course. I have regrets. Only a fool has no regrets. But on the big political issues, I've been consistently right.
Okay.
And those who rule us have been consistently wrong.
Well, when it comes to ISIL and their links with Saudi Arabia, break it down for me what role you think Saudi Arabia is playing on that, and answer this question as well. Like, do you think there's any country as messed up and brutal as Saudi Arabia today?
No, I think Saudi Arabia's pretty near the top of the charts for messed up and brutal. And I would say that the closest comparator to ISIS is the forces of Abu Wahhab, the founder of the trend called Wahhabism, which is the official religion or take on the religion in Saudi Arabia. The head-chopping, heart-eating, massacring, slave-taking, all of the horrors of ISIS were prefigured by the ideological or theological forerunners of the Saudi regime. And as you know, the historic alliance between Ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, and the Wahhabists was very clear and very well covered, well charted. And so there is, if you like, a historical, ideological connection between Saudi Arabia and ISIS that can't be denied. Right. There's also quite evidently a significant amount of startup funds for Al-Qaeda emanated from Saudi Arabia, and Al-Qaeda, of course, partly mutated into ISIS. I don't regard them as different things, as separate things. And I don't know the extent to which the Saudi regime has itself been supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS directly, but I know that they have facilitated, turned a blind eye to private financial support for this phenomenon in the world today. And I also know that they have supplied huge amounts of weapons and money and material to other Syrian rebel groups, knowing that no sooner had that material arrived that Al-Qaeda and ISIS would simply take it. And that's what they have done.
When you think about the irony of America's relationship with Saudi Arabia, Saudi's funding of ISIL, and America using ISIL as the greatest internal and external threat to America, I mean, how do you explain that to someone? Because these are very complicated things, and unless you really take time to read about it and talk to people, you don't understand it. I mean, that triangle of relationship, how do you understand why that is able to exist?
Well, I don't know why it's able to exist, but I do know how. And it has a long a long record. We could go back quite a long way, but let's just go back to Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Okay.
The decision was made by the United States and Britain as a junior partner, as always, to take the view that my enemy's enemy is my friend. This is a fatal error. And that's why I asked David Cameron in my first question when I was re-elected back in 2012. I asked him if he had read Frankenstein right to the end, because of course once the monster is created, it breaks free of its creator and does whatever it wants. That's why it's called a monster. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. All the support, all the money and weapons and propaganda support, diplomatic support that was given to the anti-Soviet rebellion at that time built up what became the Al-Qaeda and also, of course, the Taliban, which helped bin Laden to operate out of Afghanistan. So given the very high price that the people of the United States paid on 9/11 and on other occasions at the hands of Al-Qaeda, it is simply mind-boggling that the United States government can now, again, just a little more than a decade later, be back in bed with these very same people.
Is the best way to look at it that the American government is, stupid, or that it's strategic? Because some people look and say, the military-industrial complex, perpetual wars, that's how America stays the world power.
Well, I'm usually, and in this case, certainly, an advocate of the cock-up school rather than the conspiracy school. Okay. Doesn't mean there are no conspiracies, but not everything is a conspiracy. I always put it this way. Don't imagine that our rulers are James Bonds. They're more Austin Powers. And I think that in George Bush, we had a pretty close approximation of Austin Powers. Right. There are, of course, devilishly clever people in the background who, I'm thinking of Dick Cheney, who can drive things, who can manipulate things. But generally, I think our rulers make decisions which are just catastrophically wrong. Now, whether they're fools or whether they're knaves, and which would be worse, is of course a moot point. But I was once trapped in a lift with William Hague when he was the Foreign Secretary of Britain. Okay. It was his misfortune to be trapped in a lift with me. And it gave me the chance to say to him, William, you've been wrong before. In fact, you've been wrong most of your life. But you've never been insane before. But your policy of effectively, objectively encouraging these fanatics to go to Syria to fight, your policy of bombing Libya to pieces, allowing the almost unbelievable thought of even worse than Gaddafi coming to power in Libya. These policies are insane. They're not just wrong, they are insane. And they will one day cost us very, very dearly. And indeed they are.
Interesting. And what did he say to you? Or did he just get off the elevator?
Well, he was really lucky that the lift doors finally opened and he bolted the course without giving me a proper answer.
Interesting. One thing when I was thinking about your engagement with, you mentioned Hague and with Hitchens, you're known for being, a great debater. That's, you've won accolades for that. I'm wondering, in your time, who the person gave you the best run for your money?
That's a good question. Good question. Michael Hessel, maybe. Okay. The former deputy prime minister to John Major. Okay. Maybe him. He was pretty good. Enoch Powell, the veteran right-wing English politician, sometime racist. He He was pretty good. Not because their ideas were right, but because they were quite good at bamboozling people.
Yeah. What do you think, just generally speaking, makes someone a good debater? What is the skill? Is it just confidence? What is it?
Well, in the case of Heseltine, it would be education and the Oxbridge training school. The Oxford Union turns out people who can argue persuasively whichever side of the debate they are given to argue, which I never could do. I never had such an education anyway, but I couldn't and wouldn't do that. But they're able to argue in courts when they become Queen's counsels and barristers, just as persuasively that the person is innocent as they are that the person is guilty. In other words, they have no principles. They are simply good at making the best argument they can for the line they've decided to pursue, and that carries on into the political class. In the case of Powell, however, in that sense, he would be closer to me in this sense, that although entirely opposite to mine, Powell had real principles, real beliefs, a real set of beliefs. And if you have such a set of beliefs, assuming you're not simply incapable of speaking, and some people are obviously better at speaking than others, having this reservoir, this bank of belief, then gives you, I think, a special ability.
Right.
But to take this point further in a self-critical way, although on the subjects that I am deeply involved in, I'm a pretty hard guy to defeat in an argument. There are many, many subjects where I could not begin to muster an argument. And so I don't want you to imagine that if you ask me now to give a speech and make an argument on, I don't know, something very technical, pensions, for example, or other slightly esoteric subjects, obscure financial instruments or whatever, that I could make a good argument. I couldn't. I wouldn't be able to muster the beginnings of an argument.
And one thing too, when you're debating someone, when I especially think about your debates about Israel, I know, and I wanted to ask you about not with Israelis, but the idea that you have to understand each individual person from where they're coming from. I mean, you were raised, if I remember correctly or read correctly, in the leanings of the left, from a family that you grew out of how you were raised. And when you think about someone who's born in Israel, who is that's the reality that they were born into, that the rest of the world is against them, that they need this place. I mean, you're never going to convince an Israeli or someone who sympathizes with Israel just by your argument. I mean, does it ever frustrate you that you would literally have to sit down and talk with someone, become friends with that person, and then maybe convince them otherwise through, conversation and chat? I mean, is that how you approach debates? Like, because you can't just yell or no one's going to listen to you, right? I mean, how do you take that into account?
But many of my friends are Israelis, and they agree in virtually every particular with me. My best Israeli friend would be Professor Ilan Pappé, nowadays of Exeter University, formerly of Haifa University, one of the greatest Israeli intellectuals. He's an Israeli who entirely rejects the apartheid ideology of Zionism. So it has nothing whatever to do with the passport that someone carries, still less, as should be obvious, what religion they profess. It's about what their political take on this great ideological question is. And as I put it in my Oxford Union speech, if you've seen that at the Oxford Union, I gave two long addresses, which are, I think, worth looking at. They've been well looked at. I made the point very clearly. I would not have debated in a university after you, sir, no, after you, and let's adjourn for dinner and port afterwards, a supporter of South African apartheid. How could I?
Right.
I was in a mortal struggle with South African apartheid. It's not a matter for a student or schoolboy debates. And so if I could not have done so with a supporter of South African apartheid, I'm certainly not going to do so with supporters of Israeli apartheid. So it's nothing to do with their nationality. I don't debate with Israeli supporters of Zionism.
Okay.
That's my position. No recognition and no normalization.
But you support BDS, right?
Well, insofar as BDS has become an organization, and the answer to that would be up to a point. I support the boycotting and the divestment and sanctions on Israel. And I believe that the duty of people who are not direct actors in this political conflict is to side with the victim. And that means not recognizing or normalizing with the perpetrator.
Now, it's interesting, right, because there's the whole controversy around whether, the intellectual boycott. But I think about Islamophobia. And I think about people who are fearful of Muslims. They only believe what they see on Fox News. But it was only when I really had close Muslim friends that I realized that those were everything I knew was bullshit, essentially. Don't you think, though, that only through the intellectual, debates with certain people, you can see progress? If you totally alienate them, it's only going to create more hatred. What do you think?
Well, Islam is a religion. Zionism is not. It would be unconscionable, despicable, unpardonable to refuse discourse with someone because of their religion. And I never have and never would.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean I should debate with Nazis, for example. I have nothing to debate with a Nazi.
Right.
The Nazi has to be dealt with in a completely different way. I'm one of those who supports the criminalization of Holocaust denial, for example. I don't take the American Civil Liberties Union approach to whether or not people can dress up in Nazi uniforms and march through predominantly Jewish areas. I say no. I say no compromise at all with an ideology like Nazism. So these are ideological questions, political questions, not religious ones.
Right.
So your comparison, your metaphor doesn't really work.
But a lot of people, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of call you an anti-Semite. Do you think it's absolutely unfair to call you an anti-Semite? And why do you think people don't understand the other side of it? Why don't people learn this part about you?
Well, they do understand it. They do understand it very well. This is a tried and tested tactic of the supporters of Israel to brand opponents of Israel, opponents of Zionism, as being anti-Semitic. In my case, nobody who knows anything about me, anything about my politics, could entertain for 1 second the idea that I could hate a whole group of people because of their religion. It's simply absurd. It's not just unfair, it's absurd.
But would you say it is fair that people don't see that side? Then they do think you're anti-Semitic?
Anti-Semitism exists, of course, and has the blood of many millions of people on its hands.
Right.
There are anti-Semites around. Some of them are in the Muslim community. Many of them are white Ku Klux Klan types.
Right.
Anti-Semitism exists. But how can someone like me, a leftist, anti-racist, all of my life, since childhood, be credibly accused of racism, which is what anti-Semitism is.
I mean, people have sort of accused you of, rallying support for votes against Israel. Do you think there's any times you might have gone too far or could have toned down anything, or that is something that, you don't look back and be like, okay, maybe I was sort of in election season mode and it was a little bit, no?
As I say, look, the Israel, Zionism, and Judaism and Jews are entirely separate things. Right. Most Zionists are not Jews. Many Jews are not Zionists.
Right.
The attempt to conflate these things is not only wrong, intellectually dishonest, but very dangerous.
Right. Is there anything you want to go on record saying that you like about the state of Israel, or there's literally nothing that you would say, you know what, this is good?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Of course, there are people in Israel who are immensely talented, right, immensely productive, because most of them are Jews, and Jewish people are in huge, disproportionate numbers immensely talented, immensely productive. So it doesn't surprise me that out of the state of Israel comes many technical and scientific and other innovations.
Right.
How could it be otherwise? If you gather
right,
several million Jewish people in a state, you're going to get that kind of creativity, that kind of development.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why Palestine was able to be wiped off the map, because of the superior development and skills and experience of the Jews who went there.
Right.
But do I see anything positive in the Israeli state? Not at all.
It's interesting your role as a presenter. I'm a journalist myself, obviously, and you've worked with Press TV, Russia Today, Al Mayadeen. Could you ever acknowledge that you've, at any point, spouted out propaganda on behalf of any of those regimes that, looking back now, you wish you hadn't of, or that you wish you would have had more information before you took?
No, I absolutely have not.
Okay.
I have never been asked to say anything,
okay,
or asked not to say something by any of my employers. On the radio, I'm a radio presenter of many years standing, so neither on British radio, nor on Russia Today, nor on any of the other channels that I have worked for, has anyone ever asked me to say something that I didn't believe, or not say something that I did believe. And if they ever had, I'd no longer be working for them.
Okay. That opening statement we started about, you said you hate imperialism most. And I was wondering, when you look at how you analyze countries, and you have a very strong distaste for America and America's foreign policy, do you think there is sometimes this lesser of two evils approach when you analyze countries? Do you think the way that you analyze countries and their relationships to the U.S. is really embedded in the fact that America is arguably the most imperialist country?
Well, first of all, I don't believe in countries.
Okay.
I hate nationalism.
Okay.
I hate flags. They do nothing for me. So I don't support or oppose anything or anybody because of the country or the flag that they fly. I take a position on the issues, on the subject, not on who's involved in it. So, for example, when Boris Yeltsin was looting Russia and permitting it to be looted by his oligarch friends, most of which then ended up in London, you could have described me as anti-Russian if you're going to accuse me of being pro-Russian. Now, I support the limited extent to which Putin has redressed the failures of the Yeltsin years and oppose Putin where he needs to be opposed. It's nothing to do with the name of the country or the flag that they fly. As to the United States, you're talking here to the man who is the great-grandson of the only woman in the whole of the 19th century who emigrated from New York to Dundee in Scotland. And if you've seen New York and if you've seen Dundee, you'll know just how weird and strange a decision that was. So I have American blood in me. Far from hating America, I love it. I love the physical contours of America. I love the literature, the sporting achievement, the can-do spirit, and so on of the United States. What I hate is American imperialism. It's really not rocket science.
Right. You know, I wanted to ask you about that speech, your famous speech in front of Congress, I believe it was, with Norm Coleman. And I'm wondering, have you
the Senate?
Sorry, yeah, your speech at the Senate with Norm Coleman. Have you followed the man's career since those days?
I have. I campaigned. I campaigned and helped to bring about his defeat in Minnesota.
Interesting.
And I happened to be in Minneapolis on the day the final court decision was made, and he became ex-Senator Norman Coleman, which was a very happy day for me. I do know that after a long period of being Israel's foremost friend, he's now a lobbyist for Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. I read that in an article, and there was a guy quoted in it said that he's clearly guided by political motivations and not moral convictions. And here he was sort of grilling you on your moral and political convictions. I mean, and this is a tough one, and I want to ask because you are a politician. Is it really possible to keep your hands clean in politics? Is it really possible to maintain your moral convictions, especially at that high level? I mean, what do you think about, first of all, what do you think about Norm, the fact that he's clearly a huge hypocrite, but isn't that reflective of all politicians, anyone who wants to get into the highest seats of power?
Well, it's typical of most of the politicians that have hitherto ruled us. I think the election of Jeremy Corbyn the other day as leader of the Labour Party may be a very important harbinger of change, because nobody could be more pure as the driven snow than Jeremy Corbyn. So it doesn't have to be that way. And insofar as it has been that way, then that's a significant reason for the problems that we have in the world. The corruption of the political process, which is, of course, most advanced in your country, is also advancing here in ours,
right,
and no doubt in others also.
But and in the idea of power and like power being able to corrupt, we talked about Saddam. You've met some of the most powerful men who have ever existed, or had extreme power, and you yourself have had power. Have there ever been any times when you've started to realize that if you went any further with something, you would be compromising some of your morals? Is it fair to say that it can be this intoxicating and corrupting thing that you have to monitor on a day-to-day basis? Could you say that from your own experience?
Well, actually, I have never had any power. I have been a backbench rebel all of the nearly 30 years that I sat in Parliament. If I am elected as Mayor of London in May, then you can say I have some power, even if it's only power over the buses and the cycling lanes and the underground trains and so on. It's not power in the global sense. So no, I have never felt that challenge, though I recognize, of course, the point that you make, that power can be corrupting. But I gave you an example of Cuba earlier. Power never corrupted the Cuban leadership. The son of Che Guevara lives, I don't know if the wage is still $30, but it won't be much more, lives on $30 a month and lives in a very basic apartment and goes to work every day, even though his father is a global icon.
Right.
And if he left Cuba and became an international playboy, he'd no doubt be dancing on the yachts of oligarchs off the coast of Corfu right now. But such corruption, despite any other shortcomings of the Cuban regime, such corruption has never existed there.
Right. You lived with his son or near his son?
I know his son. I lived in the same apartment block when I was researching a biography of Fidel Castro that I published some 10 years ago.
Did the influence of Guevara in your politics and your early sort of leftist thinking come from knowing him, or were you a fan of Guevara and then you just happened to be in that situation?
Yeah, I met him in the lift, the son of Guevara. Of course, I never knew Guevara. He died when I was 13, but I consider myself a soldier in Che Guevara's army.
Just lastly, I'm just wondering, we talk about a lot of devastating things. I mean, so much struggle, so much war, so much pain, and all the things that you're involved with. And fighting to be the mayor of London will involve a lot of struggles. But what motivates you? What gives you hope on a personal level? Because I'm always curious about that with people who strive for so long for things that seem impossible.
Well, I strongly believe in the things I believe in. I'm in tip-top condition. Not only can I now say for the first time that I'm a non-drinking, non-smoking, non-gambling, no vice political figure. I've always, as a lifelong non-drinker, been able to bounce out of bed early every morning with a never decreasing hunger for the work that I do. I believe in it. I believe that it has been worthwhile and that it has made a mark. And if I'm right, and that there is a God, and that there is a judgment day, I hope it will help me get through the pearly gates